You're also not limited to interacting with the request in an intersetter. You can also interact with the response. You do this by adding something here to handle, because handle actually gives you an observable, which I guess makes sense because in the end, your request is an observable to which you subscribe in the end. So this in the end is the request with the response in it, you could say, wrapped into an observable. And therefore here you can of course add pipe and do something with the response if you want to. You could add the map operator here to change the response. For example, of course, you should be careful with that and not change it in a way that the rest of your application breaks. Or, what I'll do here, you use tab, which you need to import from RxJS operators, to simply look into the response. Now here in tab, you get an event, and that's important. You always get events here. Remember, I showed you that you can observe different kinds of responses with the Angular HTTP client. No matter what you chose there, here in the intersetter, you always get an event so that you have the most granular access to the response you could possibly have. So here, for example, we could check if the event type is equal to the HTTP event type, which you also need to import, of response, because here maybe I only care about that response. I will log the event before that, however, so that we can see all events we got. And then in here, we could say response arrived, body data, and then simply console log the event body, which here is the response body, of course. Now here again, I'm just doing some logging, but as I just mentioned, you could use other operators like map here and even transform the response. That would be possible. So now if we save that and we go back and we have a look at the console, we see a bunch of output there. Let me clear it to make it a bit easier. And fetch posts again, and now you see request is on its way. Then we have type 0, which is this, the request is now sent event. Then we got the response. Therefore, we now got that response arrived log, and there indeed we now see the response body being logged because that is what I'm doing here. So this is possible too. You can not just interact with the request inside of your intersetter, you can also interact with the response if you want to. You can log it, you can manipulate it, whatever your requirements are. Now to finish up this topic on intersetters, and by the way, we'll see intersetters again in the authentication section of this course, but to wrap it up for now, let's add a second intersetter. Because you're not limited to one, you can add as many as you want. I'll name this one logging intersetter because I only want to do some logging here. And therefore the file name is logging-intersetter.service.ts. And there we now will create a new intersetter. Feel free to pause the video at this point and try it on your own, of course. You do create it by exporting a class, which you should name appropriately, like logging intersetter service. This has to implement the HTTP intersetter interface, which you import from @Angular common HTTP. This forces you to add an interset method, which then in turn gets a request, which is of type HTTP request, and which gets this next object function thing, which is of type HTTP handler. And there you should return next handle, as you learned. And since HTTP request is generic, you should also add angle brackets there and define the type of data it will eventually wrap. Now to next handle, you also have to pass your request in. This is a basic intersetter, but of course it's not doing any logging, which it should if we have a look at the name. So here I will now do some logging, and of course log whatever you want here. So here I'll just log outgoing request and maybe also the URL, though you could of course also log the headers or whatever you want. And on the response, I will now again pipe the tab operator, which is imported from RxJS/operators, where I got the event. And here we could now log all events again, but I only care about the response. So I'll compare the event type to HTTP event type response. And in there, we can console log incoming response and also console log the event body, so the response body if you want to. Now it's a very simple logging intersetter. In the auth intersetter, I'll therefore get rid of that extra logging I'm doing here. So I'll get rid of that pipe method and just return the modified request. I'll also not log these two statements here so that I have a leaner intersetter here. So this intersetter is now only attaching the auth header, and the other intersetter is responsible for logging. Now we just need to add them both. And now here comes something super important. The order in which you provide them matters, because that will be the order in which they are executed. So in the app module here, of course, we provide the other intersetter, the logging intersetter, by simply repeating this object in that providers array. And here you now point at that logging intersetter service, which you have to import. But now this auth intersetter will run first, and thereafter comes the logging intersetter. Now often the order might not matter, but if it does, be aware of that order and order your intersetters accordingly so that the order in which they execute fits your use case and whatever you're doing in your intersetters. And to prove that order thing in the logging intersetter, I'll actually also console log the request headers, because there, since the logging intersetter comes second, we should see that custom key, this auth key, being added. So now with that, if we save that, let me clear the console and fetch it again. We see outgoing request and the URL. We see the headers, and in there, indeed, we have that auth thing with the value of XYZ. And we have incoming response, and we see the response body. And now to really prove that order thing, remember that here we see auth XYZ. Now I guess you can already imagine what will happen if I switch the order here and we log first and thereafter we add the key. Well, if we do that and I clear that and then I fetch, then of course you see we still log the same as before, but if we inspect our headers, here we only got that custom header, which we're not setting in an intersetter. We're missing the auth header though. So the order matters, but other than that, providing multiple intersetters is extremely simple, as you can tell. So that's it for the HTTP module. Quite a long module where you learned a lot about the Angular HTTP client. Now the most common task you will do is of course that you send requests by using post, get, and so on, by adding a URL, possibly a request body, and maybe some request headers. This will be your bread and butter thing, and therefore this is the task you should practice and you should feel confident about. Always remember that these methods like get and post give you back an observable to which you have to subscribe to actually kick off the request and to send it. Since it is an observable, you can use operators, RxJS operators, to transform the data, log data, catch errors, or whatever you want to do. But ultimately, you need to subscribe, and you can do this in a service or in a component, depending on where you need to work with the response. And in the subscribe method, you pass in a function to handle the data you get back, and possibly also an error handling function like this one. This is how you generally work with HTTP requests. Now you got advanced features like the possibility of setting what you want to observe if you are interested in the response or just the body of the response or all the events, which type of data should be returned. You can set query params, and you have that very useful features of intersetters, which can really help you save time and code if you have some header that needs to be appended to every outgoing request, for example. And as I already mentioned, we'll see intersetters in action again later in the course once we add authentication. For now, this is it. Let's now move on to the course project and practice using these HTTP requests there. Let's now apply our newly gained knowledge about sending HTTP requests in our course project. So here's the recipe book as we left it after the last course project section. And now my goal is to make sure that we can actually click these manage, save data, and fetch data buttons to, well, save all our recipes on a server in the web, and with the fetch data button, of course, to fetch them. So the idea is pretty simple. The idea simply is that we can store and fetch all our recipes we created on demand. Now, obviously, you can alter this in a lot of different ways. You could auto fetch any recipes whenever the application starts or anything like that. The core thing we'll handle in this section, of course, is the sending of the HTTP requests. So let's take care about this now. For this, we of course need a backend. And just as in the HTTP section, I will use Firebase here because I don't want to write any server-side code because that's simply not the course for that. Angular doesn't run on the server after all. You could of course have your own backend written in PHP or Node or whatever you want. But this again is not the focus of the course, so we will use Firebase here since it's easy to set up, free to use, and has everything we need here. So on firebase.com, visit the Firebase console just as we did it in the last course section, and there create a new project which you can give any name you want. Now I will name it NG Course Recipe Book, but again, you are free to pick any name you want here. So NG Course Recipe Book, accept both checkmarks or both terms here, and then create that project, and definitely check out that last course section where we used the HTTP service Angular offers for the first time so that this is not brand new to you. With this created, let's open our project, and just as before, we'll use a database, and we'll use that real-time database. So not Firestore, because that's a bit more clunky to use, but instead we'll use the real-time database down here, create a database, and for now, start in test mode, so that we have unlimited read and write access without being authenticated, though we will add authentication soon in a separate module. So for now, start in test mode, enable this, and create your database in that Firebase project. And now, as you learned in the last section, this will be the URL you use to save data, or at least a part of that URL we'll use. But before we'll use that, let's go back to our code, and let's make sure that here we have some way of interacting with the backend and of using the Angular HTTP service.